Okay, so remember, exchange rates affect the prices of domestic goods that are coming from exchange rates affect the price of goods that are coming in from another country. So the relationship between domestic prices and foreign goods prices changes every time the exchange rate changes. Makes a big deal to us as consumers. China likes their prices of Chinese goods to be low in the United States. How do they achieve that? They manipulate their exchange rate. Okay? President Trump said when he was a campaigner, when he was running for office, that the very first thing he would do, the very first day he was in office, was declare China a currency manipulator and do something about it. Well, he didn't. He's going about it a different way, and we need to talk about that. And okay, so he said that. All right. So we want to talk about tariffs. The different way the president has gone to try to fix the problems we have with trade is by using tariffs. Tariffs, again, being taxes on imports. The United States has among the lowest average tariffs in the world, and you can see that our average tariff is under 2%. And if you look around, you can see Russia's at 3%, South Korea's at 4%, Japan's at 1%, China's at 4%. Tariffs are not very high, and the reason that most tariffs in the world are not very high is this general agreement on tariffs and trade that has become the World Trade Organization, and we'll talk about that. But we have among the lowest average tariffs in the world. On the other hand, there are goods like tobacco, alcohol, and some other products that can have tariffs as high as 350%. So we want to protect certain industries. The Founding Fathers debated this long and hard. The Founding Fathers tended to be free traders, but they weren't afraid to put a tariff on to stop the British from importing cloth into the United States if we wanted to build a clothing industry in the United States. So we have tobacco tariffs that go as high as 350%. We not only have tariffs on alcohol, but we have taxes, other kinds of taxes that apply to imported alcohol. If you buy a bottle of Scotch whiskey, that's more tariff and tax than it is whiskey, the cost of that bottle. So, I mean, we sit around and people argue that, hey, it's terrible. Canada has a potential tariff. They have a system where if we import, because of NAFTA, if we import, and we'll talk about this more, if we sell a whole bunch of milk into Canada, up to a certain amount of milk, we don't pay any tax. Once we hit that limit, then we're paying 250% tax on importing more milk into Canada. We do the same thing. We just don't think it's wrong when we do it, and we think it's wrong when they do it. So the United States, remember that the president gets to negotiate treaties and then Congress approves them. The United States actually has a trade treaty with almost every country in the world that defines. So we have very specific treaties with everybody. We have this general idea of if you don't have a treaty, this is what the tariff is. Or if you don't have it included in the treaty, this is what the tariff on that is. But then we have specific treaties with almost every country in the world that defines how we actually deal with them. Just a little reminder that the United States doesn't always honor its treaties. That area that's in bright yellow or dark yellow on this graph, all of that land by treaty belongs to the Sioux, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. Sioux tribes own all of that land. Half of South Dakota, big chunks of North Dakota, Nebraska, and Wyoming. We stole it from them. And they went to court. It wasn't settled until the 1980s. They went to court. The Native Americans won and were offered $1 billion by the government as a settlement. And the Native Americans said no and are continuing to pursue it in court because they want the land. There's a treaty, and we didn't follow it. Anyway, the United States has free trade agreements. We think very often the only one we hear about is NAFTA. In fact, we have free trade agreements with Australia, Bahrain, Chile, Colombia, what's called the DR-CAFTA agreement, which is Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. That's the Central America Free Trade Area. Israel, Jordan, South Korea, Morocco, the NAFTA agreement, which is U.S., Mexico, and Canada, Oman, Panama, Peru, and Singapore. So Central and South America, much of Central and South America falls under a free trade agreement. Australia falls under a free trade agreement, and then a lot of the Middle East falls under a free trade agreement, and South Korea. Okay, so we have all of these free trade agreements with countries all over the world where there are no tariffs between us and them. So the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, is the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. As I'm writing this, NAFTA is still in effect. There's been a negotiated treaty to replace NAFTA, but hasn't been approved yet. So NAFTA was negotiated by H.W. Bush as Republican, was passed by a Democrat-controlled Senate, and it was implemented by Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat. I would note that in 2008, both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, who were running for president at that time, they were running to be the Democratic nominee, and Obama would win the nomination, declared that they would renegotiate NAFTA within 6 months of becoming president because there's problems with it. They never renegotiated NAFTA. So Obama promised to do it when he was running for president and then never did it while he was president. NAFTA does not create open borders. In a system where there are totally open borders, in Europe, there are some very interesting things where you can live in Poland, walk across the border, work in Germany, and then go home at night and live in Poland. Well, what happens if you allow that free movement of workers from country to country? The answer is that wages are going to tend to equalize, that everything is going to tend to equalize. You're going to have an equilibrium that spans the borders. Instead of Poland having low wages and Germany having high wages, the border area of Germany and the border area of Poland are going to end up with intermediate kind of wages. Okay? NAFTA has free movement of goods in it, but it doesn't have free movement of workers in it. And that would make a big difference if it did. Since NAFTA, trade within the zone of the three countries has quadrupled. The value of trade between those three countries is 4 times what it was before. The U.S. lost about 350,000 auto jobs, mostly to Mexico, and Mexico gained about 500,000 auto jobs since then. U.S. consumers pay lower prices. One of the things we note, for example, is if you look at clothing prices in the United States, the price of clothing hasn't risen very much in the last 30 or 40 years. The price of clothes in the United States on average is maybe 20% higher today than it was in 1980. That's a long time ago. How have we kept the price of clothing from going up? The answer is we've stopped making clothes in the United States and we make them in other countries. So we make clothes in countries where they pay really low wages to their workers. That keeps down the prices of clothes in the United States. We can make anything we want to in the United States, but sometimes it's going to be really, really expensive for us to do that. So there's this trade-off. Economics is full of trade-offs. The United States has traded and has said we're going to have low clothing prices, and to do that we make clothes outside the United States rather than inside the United States. The other part of NAFTA, and the part that both Obama and Clinton were really focused on when they said they wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, was the fact that there's no environmental restrictions in NAFTA. So polluting factories in the United States simply moved under NAFTA into Mexico. Since NAFTA, Mexico City has become the most polluted city on earth. We have cleaned up pollution. California, Southern California, LA used to have 300 days a year where they were under smog alert. Las Vegas used to have 30 or 40 days a year we were under a smog alert. Basically, zero smog alerts now. Why? Because we've cleaned up cars. Cars are cleaner than they used to be. And factories have picked up and moved. So we've exported our pollution. We've moved the pollution to Mexico or to India or somewhere else. And by doing that, we haven't actually cut the amount of pollution in the world. We've just moved it somewhere else. The deal to replace NAFTA is called the U.S.-Mexican-Canada Agreement, so that's USMCA. Sounds like it's the Marine Corps, but it's not. So it has very few changes, actually, from NAFTA. The number of changes are maybe 6. So the first thing it does is there's a percentage requirement. One of the things that these treaties do is look at where things come from. What you don't want to do is make free trade between Mexico and the U.S. and then allow Canada to ship stuff to Mexico and then have Mexico ship that to the U.S. and have it avoid paying a tax just because it went through Mexico. So there's all these point of origin things. There's to have zero tariff today. For a car to have zero tariff when it comes into the United States or sold in the United States, 62.5% of its content has to be from the United States or Canada. Okay? Under the new agreement, it has to be 75% U.S., Canada, or Mexico. So that increases the percentage that has to be North American. It also requires that 40% of auto workers be paid at least $16 an hour. That is 4 times what the current pay rate in Mexico is. Ford makes most of the parts for its cars and trucks in Mexico. If they have to pay $16 an hour instead of $4 an hour, what's going to happen? Well, the price of cars is going to go up. So there are estimates of things like $1,500 to $2,000 increase in the price of the average car sold in the United States. So this agreement, good for steel workers, good for car workers, maybe not so good for the American consumer because the American consumer is going to have to pay significantly more money to buy a car. There are other things in here which are really probably pretty important. So there weren't any intellectual property restrictions in NAFTA and nothing about digital business. So ebooks and CDs, and which nobody buys anymore, and digital downloads of movies and music and all that is more protected now in the USMCA. It didn't really have any protection in NAFTA because in the 90s, we didn't have all that stuff. The late 80s, early 90s, all that stuff wasn't there. Now this digital age, there's all this digital stuff, nothing's, most of you don't own books and buy CDs or buy vinyl or everything's digital in your world. Now that protection is there and those digital businesses are included in the USMCA. There's also a section in the USMCA about currency manipulation, about trying to get those countries. And Canada and Mexico don't really manipulate their currency. And again, we saw that graph of Mexico. That's not what would be happening if you were manipulating your currency. But there's some stipulations in there about not manipulating your currency. This is a content from a 2015 Honda Civic. It shows that 65% of the content of that 2015 Honda Civic, 65% of the content is from the U.S. or Canada, so it's above the 62.5% limit that's in effect right now, and there would have been no tariff paid on this car. If the USMCA goes into effect, then that 65% would not be enough, and all of a sudden there would be a 25% tariff on this car, and its price would go up by about $5,000. Okay, so let me say that again. 62.5% now is the limit because this is over 62.5%. This Honda Civic, which was assembled in a factory in Ontario, Canada, meets the requirement. No tariff was paid. If that limit goes to 75%, and Honda does nothing, the price of this car will go up by about $5,000, the price of this Civic. Even though it's built in Canada, the price of this Civic is going to go up by $5,000. Honda needs to find some way, if the USMCA passes, they need to find some way to increase the US, Canada, and this is just US, Canada 65%, and the New Deal is US, Canada, and Mexico needs to be 75%. So, see how that works. One of the first things that President Trump did when he was in power was to cancel this thing called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That doesn't mean it ended. It still exists. So the TPP went ahead, and the other countries went ahead and signed it. They just signed it without us. It lowered about 16,000 different tariffs and taxes. So the TPP had this huge list of tariffs that would go away, and it would have added 5 new countries to our free trade list. So it would have added Brunei, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, and Vietnam to the list of countries that we could trade with without any tariffs. Okay? 11 total countries involved in TPP. It added intellectual property protections. It added rules for labor protections. And in the USMCA, they negotiated a labor protection rule, which is basically the labor protection rule that's in TPP. So the Trump administration is touting the fact that they got this labor protection rule into the USMCA, which they turned down in TPP. Because TPP went into effect, there's some very interesting stuff going on. Welch's used to sell a lot of grape juice to Japan. Now they don't get to sell grape juice to Japan because Japan has a tariff on grape juice. If you're South American and you're part of TPP, so if you're Chile or a country like that in South America that grows grapes, you can sell your grape juice to Japan with no tariff because you're part of TPP. The United States, because we didn't become part of TPP, can't sell grape juice to Japan anymore because Welch's has to pay a tariff, and they've been complaining in Washington and trying to get somebody in Washington to do something about the grape juice tax. The big problem that people complained about in TPP, and what we don't know how it would have worked, and we'll see, but things usually work different for us, is how enforceable it was. There were arguments that the way TPP was set up, other countries could force us to do things we might not want to do. And of course, the other argument is that we might not be able to force the other countries in it to do things they had agreed to do. The problem with treaties always between two countries is that country A doesn't have any way to make country B follow the agreement. If country A doesn't like what country B is doing, its only choice is to try to renegotiate or get out of the treaty. But you can't, there's no court that you can go to. There's no judge and jury that says, yeah, you screwed this up. In the World Trade Organization, there's some of that, but even that doesn't seem to work too well. The problem with all these trade treaties is how do you get countries to follow them? Countries agree to them, and then they don't follow them. And if you like 95% of what country A is doing in your treaty, and you don't like the other 5%, do you ignore the 5%? How do you deal with countries that aren't playing by what you think the rules are?